The rain came down in angry sheets that night, slapping against the cracked windshield of an old blue pickup truck crawling along the dark country road. Inside sat Daniel Cole, a tired single dad whose life had been a constant uphill climb since his wife passed 2 years ago. The heater barely worked, and his wipers squeaked like they were complaining about every swipe, but Daniel didn't care. He had just finished his 3rd shift that week, cleaning offices after fixing cars by day, anything to keep the lights on for his 6-year-old son, Mason. He was bone-tired, eyes heavy, when he saw something unusual ahead. A car parked crookedly on the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking weakly through the storm. Daniel slowed down. He could have kept driving. He had every reason to. He was late, hungry, and still had groceries melting in the back seat. But that flicker of decency, the one his father once called, the soul's voice, pushed him to pull over. As he stepped into the pouring rain, his boots sank into mud, and he squinted through the darkness. A woman was standing by the car, soaked through, her elegant trench coat clinging to her like paper. Her hair, once perfectly pinned, was now a wet mess, and her high heels were no match for the roadside muck. "Need a hand, ma'am?" Daniel shouted over the roar of the rain. She turned sharply, startled at first, then relieved. "My car just died. It won't start, and I can't get a signal out here. I've been waiting for an hour." "Let's take a look," he said, rolling up his sleeves. Exhaustion carved into his face. To her, he was just another stranger. To him, she was just another person who needed help. The hood creaked open, and Daniel bent over the engine, flashlight clenched between his teeth. "Battery's dead," he muttered. "You got jumper cables?" She shook her head helplessly. "I'm afraid not." He chuckled softly. "No worries. I got some." Within minutes, he had her car humming again. She sighed in relief, a smile breaking through her frustration. "You're a lifesaver," she said. "I don't know how to thank you." Daniel shrugged. "Just glad you're safe, ma'am. Roads are nasty tonight. You live far?" "Downtown," she said, brushing rain from her face. "You?" "Just outside of town. Small place. Me and my boy." He smiled faintly at the thought of Mason probably asleep on the couch, waiting for him. She hesitated before extending her hand. "I'm Helen." "Daniel." She looked at him for a moment, as if trying to remember something. But the storm was still pounding, and they both had places to be. "Let me pay you," she said suddenly, fumbling for her purse. He shook his head. "No, ma'am. Just glad to help. I've been stuck before, it's no fun. Besides," he added with a grin, "I don't charge in the rain." Helen laughed softly. It was a sound Daniel hadn't heard in a while, a sound of gratitude without pretense. "You're very kind, Daniel." He tipped his head, climbed back into his truck, and drove away, unaware that the woman he had just helped was Judge Helen Barrett, the same judge presiding over the custody case that would decide whether Daniel kept his son or not. The next morning, the courthouse felt colder than usual. Daniel sat nervously at the plaintiff's table, tugging at the collar of his only decent shirt. Across the aisle sat his late wife's parents, who had filed for custody, arguing that Daniel's unstable income and unsafe living conditions made him unfit to raise Mason. He felt small, cornered, like the walls were closing in. The lawyer he'd scraped money together to hire whispered something about staying calm, but Daniel could barely hear him. His heart thudded against his ribs as the judge's door opened. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Barrett," the bailiff announced. Daniel stood slowly. Then he froze. Helen Barrett. The same woman from the rain. Her hair now perfect again, her robe crisp and commanding. Her eyes swept the courtroom, then stopped on him. For a heartbeat, she said nothing. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, but she quickly masked it behind her judicial composure. "You may be seated," she said firmly, though her voice carried a subtle tremor. As the hearing began, Daniel barely dared to look up. He was embarrassed now, worried that she might think he'd known who she was, that he'd helped her out of self-interest. But in truth, he had no idea. The lawyers spoke for nearly an hour. They painted Daniel as a man barely holding his life together, a mechanic who couldn't afford a proper home, a janitor who didn't know when to quit. Every word felt like a nail in the coffin of his hope. When it was his turn to speak, Daniel's throat tightened. "Your Honor," he began softly, eyes fixed on his hands, "I know I'm not perfect. I don't have a big house or fancy job. But I love my boy. He's my reason for everything. I'd give up food for him. I just need a chance to prove I can do right by him." Silence fell over the room. Helen watched him, and for the first time, the courtroom didn't feel like a place of judgment, it felt like a mirror. She saw not a poor man, but a father who had helped a stranger without asking for anything in return. She remembered the sincerity in his voice that night in the rain. "Mr. Cole," she said after a long pause, "please describe your daily routine with your son." He spoke plainly, about early breakfasts, long shifts, bedtime stories read with tired eyes. Every word carried love that didn't need to be dressed up. By the time he finished, Helen's expression had softened. Something human had broken through the formality of her bench. The opposing lawyer pressed for more evidence, citing Daniel's low income. But Helen interrupted quietly, "I've heard enough." Her gaze lingered on him for a heartbeat longer, and then she said, "Mr. Cole, this court finds you fit to maintain full custody of your son." Daniel blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. The sound of the gavel echoed like thunder. The case was over. Outside, as he stepped into the daylight, the world felt lighter. His lawyer clapped him on the shoulder, but Daniel barely heard him. He just smiled, tears mixing with the cold breeze. Behind him, Judge Barrett exited quietly. She paused, watching the man and his little boy embrace on the courthouse steps. Daniel turned slightly, their eyes met, and for the first time, she smiled, not as a judge, but as the woman who had once been stranded in the rain. Daniel nodded in gratitude, silently. And in that brief exchange, two lives, one weary and humble, the other powerful yet touched by grace, were changed forever.